in my working experience, Keith, one of the most humble person you come across for what he has accomplished. Brought in Ariba, then DocuSign, and then I worked with him when he was in Washington, D.C. as the undersecretary. And he did a phenomenal job. He brought the whole energy of the Silicon entrepreneurship to a bureaucracy which was not moving. And he was able to move a lot of stuff, especially on 5G and other technology itself. And now he has been nominated for a Nobel Prize. And so congratulations, Keith. Thank you for taking the time and come over. John. Thank you.
Well, this will be fun.
It'd be great.
Very often you don't get a chance to interview somebody that you consider a great friend, and you think you know them well till you get prepared for the interview, and all of a sudden you realize they've done so much more than I ever realized that you did in so many aspects. And I'm going to share just a little bit more background on this because I think it will help you put Keith's comments into perspective. He is one of the most broadly rounded individuals to be involved in so many aspects of what U.S.-India Strategic Partnership's about. Well-educated, out of Purdue. I'm an Indiana grad, but nobody's perfect on that, on it. But he went to General Motors and started working in robotics. Then he did multiple startups. Then I think you were the first entrepreneur in residence at Benchmark for the most profitable fund ever done in terms of the approach. Then he did Aruba. Then he went on to DocuSign. During this time, he was chairman of Purdue. He had the courage to say, I want to give back to this country, and I remember our discussions about the pros and cons of doing this because no good deed goes unpunished, and took on the role of really what you would call economic diplomacy. And Rakesh and Gaurav, really what USISPF about was this foundation of economic diplomacy and then doing so much more. And then you brought 12 of your peers with you to Washington for what you call statecraft, technology and implementation. And then he, as undersecretary in this role of economic diplomacy, was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in terms of the background and how we use these backgrounds to accomplish equality in life in many ways. And some nations didn't necessarily like, and we'll get into that a little bit, your position there. And now you're basically talking about being chairman of a bipartisan organization, literally located out of Purdue, on economic diplomacy and technology, how it comes together. Put together all those pieces, this is what this organization's about, except you did it as one person. So I'm going to ask you, out of all the jobs that you did, what was the one that was most fun?
Well, definitely my most fun job is being a father of 5 children. But professionally, well, I can tell you the greatest, the most fulfilling was being Undersecretary of State running economic diplomacy from a business standpoint. I think it's, Mukesh, I think it's Ariba because, we disrupted the oldest and the largest industry on earth, commerce. It was the first enterprise application written for the internet. We grew the business. We doubled our revenue quarter over quarter for 12 quarters in a row. Took it public, and now to this day, $3.7 trillion of commerce go through Ariba network on an annual basis, more than Amazon, eBay, and Alibaba combined, more than all the trade in the Western Hemisphere. So that was one that was built to last. And the beauty of that was creating that network. We used that same formula, building DocuSign into the powerhouse it is today. And we actually used that same formula at the State Department to build the Clean Network Alliance of Democracies to defeat Chinese Communist Party's master plan to dominate 5G communications.
When you think about it, there's so many lessons learned in all of that, and I'm going to move to topics we haven't even discussed that I want to ask you if that's okay.
Yeah.
Lessons learned, because there are a number of us, including your colleagues who are just on stage here, that have done this multiple times, et cetera. Key playbooks or key strategies that you learned that you wish you'd learned earlier as a CEO to advise almost half the room are young CEOs and startups. And a large part of the room is large companies that want to be like a startup
Yeah.
that we want to do. A couple key lessons learned on that, and
Yeah.
maybe one that will surprise people that they may not have heard before.
Yeah. Well, it's a great question because, building 5 companies, you learn something each time. And you keep adding those arrows into your quiver, right? You do a lot of experiments and you discard them, which is actually just as important things to avoid. I think one of the big ones is the category creation. So, we were able to create the category of B2B e-commerce at Ariba, obviously at DocuSign, electronic signature and digital transaction management, RAS, all that. Because when you're the category king, you get 80% of the industry resources and 80% of the market cap, as you know, at Cisco.
Yes.
And when you're starting a company from scratch, how are you going to compete against these big guys, right? And as you've often said, it's not the big that's going to eat the small, it's going to be the fast that eats the slow. And everybody in a rapidly changing market, everybody wants to go with the leader. And leadership is not determined by size, it's determined by momentum. So how do you build that momentum? So I think that's one of the key lessons. I think, one of the things we kind of learned along the way, we really put it to use at DocuSign, was multi-dimensional partnerships. So if you look at the potential new entrants in the DocuSign's market, it is Google, Microsoft, Salesforce, SAP, all these companies. And what we did is we did a 4-dimensional partnership with each one where they became not only customers and go-to-market partners, but also they became equity investors as well. And it's a big reason how we financed DocuSign. I mean, we had Intel, FedEx, Google, Salesforce, NTT, Deutsche Telekom, all these guys. And that really added to that momentum to position as category king. But I think the most important thing, as you know, John, it's all about building to last and making those. We call them investments to last, right? Because you got to be focused long term.
Mistake that many of the young entrepreneurs will make that you either came close to making or did make and then had to correct.
Yeah.
What would it be?
What's interesting is a lot of times, just like you, I'll get called into some of these companies that are starting out, first-time entrepreneurs, and they'll say, hey, you got to come and talk to us, And I won't even have time to get a big debriefing. And I'll just go in there and I'll say, hey, I know what your problem is. It's lack of focus. They go, how do you know? How you know? I go, do you guys have a strategic plan? They go, oh, no, we don't have a strategic plan. Things are going to change so fast in this market. You just don't understand. And competition is going to come out of nowhere. I go, no, you're just lazy.
You're just
lazy. Because the strategic plan, things are going to change. Competitors are going to come out of nowhere. Market's going to change. But if you have that strategic plan, and to me, strategy equals sequencing, then it's going to allow you to be much more agile because you have socialized some of those things, thought about it, and so when it does change, you're able to move faster. I think that's a big one. One of the things that I wish I'd done early in my career was actually spend time in the government. So think about it, John. I took 4 categories, 4 companies abroad. What do you traditionally do? You go on a listening trip for a couple of weeks. You talk to your potential customers, investors, partners, competitors even. And if I would have, I never once thought of calling the United States State Department or the Commerce Department, and those guys are there to help you. And they would have done great things. They made it go so much faster. That was one of the things I learned in government. So for any of you, when you're taking your companies abroad, to utilize those embassies because that's what they're there for.
It is amazing how much we pass on that. Several key takeaways already. Companies who get their customers to invest in them, even only $1 million. And $1 million isn't that much for a Fortune 500 company to make. But when they invest $1 million, guess what? The CEO is usually aware of it.
Yep.
And you did that unbelievable at DocuSign.
Yep.
I didn't even make the list of one of the companies he wanted. He was so well off with the customers in terms of the investment. I always say that half kidding. It is a huge differentiation. Yeah. You then build a playbook that you run it again with major speed in terms of implementation.
Yeah.
But there was no playbook for how you use entrepreneurship in a economically diplomacy type approach. We'd had business leaders
Yeah.
do certain things, Ron Brown as an example, in a prior life,
Yeah.
et cetera, but there wasn't a playbook. And you basically took the playbook, designed it, brought in a bunch of people to do it with
Yeah.
you, and you made a huge difference on a global scale
Yeah.
and got nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. Tell me about that journey.
Well, you know what's interesting is we always use the same playbook in each one of the companies, and we use it at the State Department. So that is vision, mission, values, team rules, long-term goals, strategy, all boiled down to execution. You remember that, Mukesh, from Ariba. So when I came into the United States State Department, my charge was to develop and operationalize a global economic security strategy to drive economic growth, maximize national security, and combat economic aggression. And so the first thing I did, of course, and by the way, this is rule number one when you're a CEO, is to build a high-performance team, right? And you want different temperaments, talents, and convictions because diversity of thought is the catalyst for genius. So I brought in, a whole bunch of folks who I'd worked with before, results-oriented execs, technologists, and entrepreneurs, and teamed them up with some of the smartest people on earth. These are career foreign service officers and civil servants in the State Department. They can speak 4 to 7 languages. They work their tail off. They're mission-driven. They're North Stars, national security. But they had an experience, the type of economic warcraft that we practice in Silicon Valley, right? Because it's about being that category king.
Yes.
And so when you combine that, that was really a 60-60 relationship. And what was interesting, and they told me in the State Department, hey, that's never been done. Maybe you could bring in 1 or 2 guys, but that's it. But the folks I brought in, they just worshiped the ground these State Department guys walked on, and vice versa too.
Culture.
Yeah, it really was. And it was magical.
When you did this, how did you win a Peace Prize nomination for it? Because normally we don't understand. Conceptually, what we're trying to do at U.S.-India Strategic Partnership Forum is really to establish an unbelievable win-win for all the citizens and to get security and peace in this world.
Yeah.
But you got nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize because of what you did. Can you share with the group what it was and how unique it was and perhaps some of the toes you stepped on that?
Well, it sure was a surprise. It actually reminds me of, I grew up in Ohio. My dad had a 5-person machine shop in the good times. And tough times, it was just me and him. I was welding at age 12. I remember we'd go in on Saturdays and we'd scrub the toilets. I remember him being in one stall, me being in the other. We hated it. And I could remember my dad go, Keith, we can't solve world peace, but we can try. So I'm just thinking about that when I heard about this nomination. But, first of all, when something like that happens, it is all about the team, right?
Yep.
And it's an incredibly humbling feeling. I mean, it was a surprise to me. And what it said in the nomination letter was I got nominated for the Trust Principle Doctrine and building the Clean Network Alliance of Democracies. And that Trust Principle Doctrine is what we use to build this Clean Network Alliance of Democracies of 60 countries, representing 2/3 of the world's global GDP, 200 telcos, a whole host of industry-leading companies. We also use that in our relationship in terms of strengthening U.S.-Taiwan ties. I was the highest-ranking State Department official to visit Taiwan in 41 years. I was greeted with 40 fighters and bombers. We put together an economic prosperity partnership with Taiwan, as well as a science and technology agreement. And Taiwan punches above its weight in many areas. They're, of course, a linchpin of democracy. They're also a role model of freedom. They also are by far the most sophisticated manufacturers of semiconductors. And that was one of the other things that we did is our team did the largest onshoring in U.S. history with TSMC's $12 billion semiconductor facility, which was really key to secure the semiconductor supply chain. And out of that, that really provided a catalyst, and that was one of our theories in doing this deal, was now $300 billion of investment in the United States semiconductor manufacturing, really as a result of that. We were working on Samsung, we're trying to get Intel off the dime, the ecosystem, so all that came in. And we also believe that that would serve as a catalyst to get some legislation in this area. So we worked with Senator Warren and Senator Cornyn on a bipartisan CHIPS Act, which was $50 billion for onshoring semiconductors, because we had really lost it here in the United States, even though, you know, we invented it here at Silicon Valley, only 12% of the semiconductor manufacturing being done in the United States. The other thing that we did too is we approached Senator Schumer and Senator Young, another bipartisan bill, on a $150 billion Endless Frontiers Act, which is for research funding in the 10 national security sectors. And we showed them was that if we could get this research funding, then we could get that funding level up to about $500 billion with matches from the private sector as well as our closest technological allies. Now those two bills have been combined into the U.S. Innovation and Competitive Act, which passed in the Senate, and they're working on it right now in the House. So those were some of the things that we did. But the trust principle itself, John, if you think about it, you know, the reality we face as free nations is one of ever increasing cyber warfare.
Yes.
And seemingly ceaseless variations of intense weaponized economic competition. And our rivals are playing the long game. They're playing for keeps. They're playing a four-dimensional game of military, economic, diplomatic, and cultural chess. And they have little respect for things like sovereignty of nations, rule of law, respect for property, respect for the environment, respect for human rights, respect for the press. And that's, and so if you think about it, what do? Those are things that they don't honor. Those are things that we honor in the free world as democracies, the two biggest democracies in the world. They actually use it for their competitive advantage. And so they, you know, we say is they utilize the power principles: coercion, co-option, concealment, human right, genocide in Xinjiang. And so what the trust principle doctrine was all about was using those trust principles to our advantage. And that's what we did in one jiu-jitsu move, kind of flipped it on their back and used that against them. So in essence, we weaponize the very principles that protect freedom. And so that's what that was all about.
This was a product of a dinner at your house in 2020 in January, if I remember right. A key takeaway here is the ability to outline a total architectural plan to accomplish a key goal that almost everybody would consider impossible, and being able to play the economics out on it. You won unanimous approval out of the Senate. I can't remember anybody's had that recently in a decade, both on Democrats and Republicans. You're now working with the current administration about how to continue this. Yeah. A little bit of thoughts in terms of the role that India has to play in this partnership, first in the transaction on manufacturing, semiconductors, et cetera, then the bigger relationship between our countries, and why you and I think both believe that it's the most important relationship the U.S. has.
Really is. It is the most important relationship the United States has. It's, you know, it's a great power and the biggest democracy in the world. And, you know, one of the things that we did at this dinner, we had 36 of the top CEOs in Silicon Valley. We had everybody go around the room, remember? And yes. Everybody said their favorite China horror story. We can't really talk about what was said in that meeting, but I would say it was cathartic, enlightening, and frightening at the same time. And I remember at the end of it, standing up and saying, you know, out here in Silicon Valley, we say corporate responsibility, social responsibility, but it's also global economic security. Because not only is China a real and urgent threat to democracies around the world, they're a real and urgent threat to businesses because they don't want to just compete. They want to put you out of business. And, you know, if you look at the things they do. So in other words, John, so let's say you're that Silicon Valley CEO, I'm China. If I could steal your intellectual property, if I don't have to be transparent, if I can use slave labor, if I can use these low-cost coal-fired power plants, if I don't have to be reciprocal with my market, if I am the law, or I don't have to obey the law, I'm going to beat you every time. And so that's the thing that we have to guard about. So in terms of India in the United States, there is strength in those numbers, and there's power in unity and solidarity. Because if you think what China's strategy is to pick the weak gazelle off from the herd and go pluck them. And that was the thing that the Clean Alliance of Democracies was all about. And it was built on trust. You know, it was interesting for me because of my first 60 bilaterals as Undersecretary of State. So I'm meeting with other countries. It would be like an economic minister, foreign minister, finance minister. I'd say, hey, how's your relationship with China? I'd say, well, they're an important partner. And then they go like this. They kind of look like both ways, like somebody else was in them. And they lean and they go, but we don't trust them. That rang bells in my head because a year before, I'm standing up on stage at DocuSign, and I'm saying, we're not in the software business, we're in the trust business. We deal with people's most important documents. And trust is the most important word in any language. You know, and it's the basis of every relationship, business, personal, otherwise. You buy from people you trust, you partner with people you trust, you do business with people you trust, you love people you trust. And it was clear to me that nobody trusts China. So this was, so if you look at what's the most important thing, the U.S.-India relationship, and you mentioned it in your opening dialogue, it's all about trust.
It is. So many ways. I was one of the first companies to go aggressively into China in the early 1990s because of the background with Wang and a win-win type environment. And candidly, the leadership at that time never let me down.
Yeah.
And when you lose trust, then there's a different challenge in front of you. I encouraged all 20 of my startups to not have a policy for doing business in China because I felt the downside far outweighed the upside. And most of the CEOs followed that. It was their decision on it. You wrote an article in Fortune recently about the challenges facing board of directors as well as the CEO to understand the long-term game, how this plays out until there's a change in China policy, which I believe there will eventually will be. I think they have to. But for now, it's very much of an adversarial win-lose type mentality. Key takeaways from that article?
Yeah, so, you know, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and that extreme atrocities that they're committing, you know, there's been 300 corporations around the world that have pulled their business out of Russia. Very costly. It was a surprise to all. Nobody had a plan on the shelf. You know, what that has done is that has increased the probability potentially for or for Taiwan-China conflict, for China coming into Taiwan. And as I mentioned, Taiwan represents that linchpin of democracy. And for General Secretary Xi in China, what Taiwan represents is it dispels his myth that the Chinese culture cannot live under democracy. It has to live under an autocracy. And he wants it destroyed. He wants to take it over. For businesses, if there is a China-Taiwan conflict, it would be devastating for most businesses. It'd be absolutely catastrophic for the high-tech industry for, you know, a lot of the reasons we talked about. So what I'm seeing out there is a lot of some of the most well-respected board members in corporate America are demanding of their CEOs to present their China contingency plan at the next board meeting. Because you think about it, what is a board member's fiduciary duty to shareholders? It's to mitigate risk. So you've got that plan on the shelf for, you know, in case you have a cyber breach, those kind of things. So these guys are putting these plans in place, I'm seeing, and the CEOs are beginning to implement them. By the way, this also represents a tremendous opportunity for the country of India, because a lot of it involves pulling supply chains out of China and putting them somewhere else.
When you think about maybe closing on the U.S.-India relationship, key takeaways and advice to the people in this room, and Keith, we agree on most things, we occasionally don't, but I think having that healthy dialogue is so important to ending up with the right decisions. But advice you would give us and advice you give both countries about how do we work through our differences as well as our strengths, and challenging this group from the startups to the biggest companies to the members of the press to the government on what we should do to really bring this to fruition. Closing comments.
You know, I think focus on the mere fact that we're the two biggest democracies. And I'll tell you, what I learned working in Washington is that this democracy is a 250-year-old experiment. And it goes against all the laws of physics, because the natural order of things is the bad king, the dictator, and the emperor. And you have to literally fight every day to keep those freedoms. And, you know, what I could, you know, so I'm thinking about growing up in that little house in Ohio with a white picket fence and a dog and 2.5 children. And, you know, that does not come for free. You got to fight for it every day. And if it's not like, if it's not for democracies like U.S. and India, then there's going to be a lot of this freedom's going to go away, because there's no doubt that General Secretary Xi is dictating or exporting dictator out of a box with their surveillance tools, with their money, all of that. So keep an eye on that. I think that, you know, I think that's the big thing of what we have in common. I think also for the United States to respect India as a big power and to treat them with respect. You know, I think when you see what's going on in the Ukraine and Russia, I think the United States has exercised patience. I don't know, maybe not patience, but empathy with India, and understand. We know that one of the most important characteristics is to have empathy and to put your feet in the other person's shoes. And, you know, the other thing is to understand that there's so much opportunity between these two great nations, particularly in the area of technology. And if you think about, you know, that four-dimensional game of chess, military, economic, diplomatic, and cultural chess, the crossroads are technology. And the battlefront for freedom is technology. And it's really important that technology advance freedom.
Keith, I enjoyed it very much. Please join me in congratulating Keith.
Thanks.
Awesome. Good job.